It means that the American colonies, this jewel of the British Empire, is living this contradictory history now of a society that is increasingly rooted in a labor system that's human bondage, that's racial slavery.
Anthony Johnson moved his family out of Virginia and north to Maryland. There he leased 300 acres he called Tony's Vineyard. On that farm, Anthony Johnson died. Back in Virginia, a jury decided that the land Anthony had left behind could be seized by the state because he was a Negro and by consequence an alien.
One wonders how Johnson would have viewed this changing world of Virginia. He lived a very long time. He survived and did quite well by the standards of the day, building up properties, hundreds of acres, and cattle. By the standards of the time, anyone would say he did quite well. There's no reason to believe, as of, say, the 1670s, that the Johnson family is going to be squeezed out.
Within a few years, Anthony's grandson, John, purchased another 44 acres, and in memory of his grandfather's homeland, called the farm Angola.
By the time the end of the century came, Anthony Johnson's children and grandchildren may well have been fighting to stay free. Many free people were sold into slavery. You know, they couldn't prove that they were free. They had no way of letting anybody know that they were free. So if a plantation owner came by and said, "This is my slave and I want to sell him," you were sold.
By the end of the century, nearly 58,000 people lived in the colony. 16,000 were listed as Negroes. In 1705, the Virginia Assembly passed laws clearly defining the distinction between a slave and a servant, relegating all slaves to the status of real estate. The next year, John, the third generation of Johnsons in America, died without an heir. That would be the last mention of the plantation named for Anthony's birthplace. Angola Plantation, like the Johnsons themselves, disappeared from the record books of colonial America.
The African trade is a trade of the most advantage to this kingdom of any we derive, and as it will all profit, it is indeed the best traffic the kingdom hath, as it doth occasionally give so vast an employment to our people both by sea and land. John Carey, Bristol, England.
In 1698, the English Parliament ended the monopoly of the Royal African Company on the African slave trade. It became the right of every free-born British subject to trade in slaves. Over the next half-century, the number of Africans transported to the British colonies in British ships increased from 5,000 to 45,000 a year. England became the largest trafficker in slaves in the Western world. It is the first principle and foundation of all the rest, said one British writer, the mainspring of the machine which sets every wheel in motion. He was born Igbo, the son of a tribal elder, the favorite of his mother. He died an Englishman, the father of 2 daughters, and the husband of an English woman. At the age of 11, Olaudah Equiano was kidnapped by Africans and sold to Europeans.
Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ekwe anọ ka anyị na-achọ nzomalizo. Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ekwe anọ ka anyị na-achọ nzomalizo. O jebe nkụ ya na taa. O chube iyi ya na taa. O jebe afịa ya na taa. Ekwe anọ ka anyị na-achọ nzomalizo.
When the grown people were gone far in the fields to labor, the children generally assembled together to play. And some of us often used to get up into a tree to look out for any assailant or kidnapper that might come upon us. One day, when only I and my sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls, and in a moment seized us both without giving us time to cry out or to make any resistance. They stopped our mouths and ran off with us. Olauda Equiano.
Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ekwe anọ ka anyị na-achọ nzomalizo. Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ọ bụ onye ka anyị na-achọ? Ekwe anọ ka anyị na-achọ nzomalizo. Who are we looking for? Who are we looking for? It's Ekwano we are looking for, nzomalizo. Has he gone to the stream? Let him come back. Has he gone to the market? Let him come back. Has he gone to the farm? Let him return. It's Ekwano we are looking for, nzomalizo.
For more than 4 centuries, people disappeared from the savannas, the rainforests, and the villages of Black Africa. Farmers and craftspeople, commoners and African nobility. Most were strong young men, aged 15 to 25. But women and children were also taken and sold. To obtain slaves, Africans waged war, destroying communities, stealing people. To escape the spreading violence, many moved into the interior, abandoning family compounds, farms, entire villages. In West Africa, more than 20 million people were kidnapped into slavery. Only half would survive the journey to the coast. The boy Equiano was one of the survivors.
At last, I came to the banks of a large river. I was beyond measure surprised at this, as I had never before seen any water larger than a pond or rivulet. And to my surprise was mingled with no small fear when I was put into one of these canoes and we began to paddle and move along the river.
On the journey to the coast, Equiano passed from one African master to another. Once he was sold for 172 cowrie shells. He learned 3 different languages, traveled some 800 miles, and encountered people and customs unfamiliar and frightening to him. After close to 7 months of travel on foot and by boat, he reached the African coast.
The first object that saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea, and a slave ship which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, but was soon converted into terror. O lauda equiam.
It was an ancient business, this trade in human beings between Africa and Europe. "50 years before Columbus sailed to the New World, Portuguese explorers had sailed to West Africa. At first seeking gold, they built a fort in 1482 and called it Elmina, the mine. The Portuguese pointed their guns toward the Atlantic to guard not against Africans, but against European competitors. Over time, the castle changed hands from the Portuguese to the Dutch, and finally the British. And the trade changed from gold to human beings.
Concerning the trade on this coast, we notified Your Highness already that it has completely changed into a slave coast, and that nowadays the natives no longer occupy themselves with the search for gold, but rather make war on each other in order to furnish slaves. The Gold Coast has changed into a complete slave coast. Willem de la Palma, Director, Dutch West India Company.
Along the west coast of Africa, from Senegal in the north to the Cameroons in the south, the Europeans built some 60 forts and castles, warehouses for European merchandise and for African slaves. Called factories, they were commercial centers where agents or factors traded rum, cloth, and guns for human beings and gold.
The most notable item is the slave house, which lies below ground. It consists of vaulted cellars divided into several apartments which can easily hold 1,000 slaves. Captain John Barbeau, French slave trader.
In dungeons built deep into the ocean rock, people waited. Sometimes a day, sometimes a year. These chambers